Hello and welcome to Nonprofit Reserves and Endowments. My name is Jean Bell. I direct the Advancing Practice program here at the Nonprofit Quarterly. We're really glad you could join us. What a time this is. We're recording this on March 26th, and it will live on in our membership library, but we don't want to ignore the context of today's conversation by any means. We hope that you're healthy and safe and finding ways to stay grounded through all of this. Today's topic is, of course, always important, but probably never more so than right now as nonprofits face so much uncertainty. The stock market is obviously up and down like a roller coaster over the last few days. So again, we want to deliver this essential management content to you, and we also want to have this conversation in context. So I know Paul will do that, and we expect that some of your questions may be tied to the operating context, and we welcome that. As you can see on the screen here, there is a hashtag if you're using social media to share your insights. The hashtag is NPQ Endowments. Next slide, please. I want to say a special hello to our Leading Edge members. This program will go into your Leading Edge library. As always, we encourage you to watch and rewatch this. This one's going to be a great one to watch with your board finance committee, for instance, or your investment committee, perhaps with your CFO or finance team. You can learn more about the Leading Edge membership program on our homepage. It's up in the upper right-hand corner there. Just click on it and learn more about how to access all of these webinars. At this pace, we're producing at least a webinar a month in addition to special COVID coverage. So we welcome you into that membership if it's of interest. This session, like all of our sessions, is being recorded. You'll receive a recording with the slides from us in a couple of days. You also received the slides in your confirmation email yesterday and this morning, and they also appear as a handout in your control panel. So if you're one that likes to have the slides with you as you listen, please know that they're there. You will also get a survey right as the session ends. It only takes about 3 minutes to complete and is incredibly valuable. It will give Paul the feedback that he needs, but also give me and NPQ the feedback we need to keep curating this program to meet your interests and needs. So thank you in advance for doing that. So let me tell you a little bit about our guest faculty, Paul Sussman. He's currently an independent consultant to nonprofits and businesses and philanthropies, but he's formerly the CFO or chief executive of some really important anchor institutions with very complex balance sheets, I might say, and complex asset mixes. He was the CFO of Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation, which had assets of over $750 million, and founding president of a really important California institution called the Northern California Community Loan Fund. As we say, they're really a pioneering social investment institution. Paul's been on many boards and is currently on the board of the Community Music Center. I want to emphasize that Paul, as you can see, is not a financial advisor. We're going to talk about how CFOs and executives and boards work with advisors and managers over the course of this conversation, but that's not Paul. He's an executive and a CFO and a consultant, and he's bringing years of really on-the-ground experience and advice to this conversation, so please know that. You should also know that this is his, quote, work bio. Paul is also a writer and solo performer. And so I hope you don't mind, Paul, I looked up your artistic bio and I found a sentence that I particularly loved, which I'm going to share with our audience, which says, Paul developed his approach to melodrama and farce through years of work in financial management with Bay Area nonprofit organizations. So I guess that all of this work in finance in some way inspires the artistic side of you as well, which is pretty amazing. So thank you for being here, Paul. We're looking forward to this conversation. And I'm going to hand it to you to kind of walk us through on the next slide, the arc of today's session.
Great, thank you, Jean. Let me reiterate what Jean said about this moment. We planned this webinar back in October and November. It's a quote from John Lennon, I think, life is what happens while you're making plans. And I think the topic is still very relevant. We're shifting some of the emphasis towards cash flow and emergency use of resources and that sort of thing. And I too hope that all of you and your families and your organizations are safe and well. And thanks for joining today amidst some difficult times. So let me run through the agenda here first. We're going to start with what problem or opportunity are you looking at when you talk about wanting an endowment, and trying to be clear about that. and we'll talk about what we mean by an endowment. It means different things to different people. It has legal meanings, it has meanings in accounting, it has colloquial meanings, and we'll talk about those things. We'll talk about how to start thinking about building an endowment, and we'll start talking about managing an endowment. I want to say, again, what Jean said, I'm not an investment professional. I'm not an attorney. I'm proud of both those things. I'm here today as from within the nonprofit community. I've managed finances. I've been a CEO. I've been on boards. There's a different perspective from within an organization than from without. And I don't want that to be misheard as don't trust a financial advisor's advice or that sort of thing. It's just we all wear the hats that we have and we see the world through those lenses. I'm talking today as somebody who has been within the organizations that have the endowments or the funds, not as a manager. And as I talk, you'll hear some of the differences in perspectives. So often when we propose projects and these sorts of things, we're pulled back by somebody being asked to approve it to be clearer about what problem we're trying to solve. And so that's where we're beginning today. And let's talk about everything about why you might need funds beyond what's in your checking account and making current payroll. So we'll begin with cash flow management. And there's really several reasons why you might need more funds for cash flow management. There are different challenges and they have different solutions to them. One is just the smoothing of a cash cycle. So for example, if you're heavily reliant on government contracts and they pay 30 days, 60 days out, you might have a nice budget, you might have a surplus, but you're always in a cash squeeze because you've got these government contract receivables. Doesn't mean you're running a loss. It's predictable. There's a set of solutions for those that are different, say, for a bridge to a particular slow receivable. Say let's just make something up. Your local or state government is in a financial crisis due to a pandemic, and they're not paying your contracts on time. It's a different kind of solution than something more predictable. And I saw in, I guess it's New York has announced a $75 million loan fund for nonprofits. Others, I think people are going to be seeing delays, not just disappearance of revenue. And that there's a different set of solutions for the sort of one-time bridges. With regard to operating funding, people look to endowments as a steady source of money to spend during the year, the payout from the endowment, and they budget for it and they spend it. It can be for general use and it can be for targeted use. And sometimes it's because the donor has said it's only for a particular use, like part of the endowment, or you raise the endowment for a particular use. And sometimes it's because the organization has said this or that program or function within the organization gets the endowment payout usually because it's high in the mission and struggling financially or just not set up in a way that can be self-sufficient. So it can be a source of stable operating funding. It can also be a source for investment in innovation, in new programs, launching new programs, getting programs on their feet. It's a different way of thinking about it. It can be an investment in a facilities project. You could set aside money because someday you want to buy a building, or you could set aside funds for sort of R&D and innovation, or you could invest in a short-term mission need. And we're looking at that right now. So you might have funds set aside. Maybe you thought you were going to use them to launch a new program, but you decided in a way you're going to invest them in something very core to the mission. Forget that idea about the building in the future. This is a once in a lifetime crisis, and we're going to think differently about that money we put away. You can also think about solving for a risk in your organization and using these funds for a risk buffer. Sometimes there are risks inherent in your line of business. I come from the world of affordable housing development, and if you're doing affordable housing development, every project you do runs $1 million risk. If you don't have that kind of capitalization or fund set aside, maybe you're not even going to be allowed to do the projects, but you could get in more deeply over your head. Everybody's got a set of risks in the business that you're in and the business lines. And you would think about what kind of funds set aside for those that are inherent in the business. And then we talk about shocks, catastrophes, what people call black swans, once in a lifetime events. We've been having a lot of once in a lifetime events these days. And we've got another on our hands. And wouldn't it be nice to have that money set away for something that no one had predicted, a one-time problem? That's really different than having it set aside for the inherent risks in your business, because you're going to need that anyway, perhaps. And the other risk that people set aside for money is a sort of deterioration or change in your business model over time. It can be a slow drip out, and you might need some funds to transition to a new way of doing business or a new revenue model, that sort of thing. There's nothing wrong with running a deficit while you're transitioning, unless you don't have the money to run a deficit. So, and that happens in most of our work. The world changes. It doesn't mean you failed or failed to anticipate it. There's another bucket of funds you might need for capital needs, and that's usually about your building. And this is different than, say, what I said about investment or innovation. Someday wanting to buy a building. You've got a building you own, you've got facilities you own. Even if you rent them, you have capital needs over time. And there are plenty of tools out there for planning for that. And some funders even require that you set aside capital reserves, so you don't have to come back to them for that roof that everybody knew was only going to last for 15 years, but you didn't set any funds aside for it. Often the capital needs are met through, say, monthly or annual deposits into a fund, but sometimes they're set up in advance, which is, again, a very different need and use. Mm-hmm. So these are all problems we're trying to solve for, and they all have different solutions. They all involve setting aside money. So let's talk about some of the questions you might ask yourself about each of these to arrive at some idea of what. Yes.
Yeah, we already have a question that I know that anticipates something you're going to talk about a little later, which I think is kind of about segmentation. You know, the question being, shouldn't we be thinking about shorter term needs a little differently than potentially longer term or crisis needs? Do you want to say anything about that now, or kind of save that for when you get to thinking about the fund structure?
Let's go to the next slide.
Okay.
And you see at the bottom there's segmentation. Right. So we're going to talk about that, but I think it's more useful to talk about some of the probing questions about each of these kinds of uses, and then we can talk about how they might be segmented or commingled. And I use the word commingled. Commingling somehow has got a smell to it, as if that means breaking the law or stealing something, but it just means mixing up funds in the same account or same buckets. So don't be afraid to use it. So for each of these uses that we talked about in the last slide, there might be an amount you're trying to reach in estimating that. And some of them are easier. So if you can estimate you need a roof every 15 years and the elevator is going to have to be replaced, and you're going to have to paint every so often and this sort of thing, it's pretty easy to come up with a sort of moving target in what year you're going to need what. Some are much harder, about risk, about investment. Some are infinite in the sense that you'd love to have a big annual payout to support half of your operations, but when you think about it, you'd have to raise a pretty darn big endowment to do that. So it's not as if there's a number that's going to come to you as the right answer. You just have to think about sizing all of these needs. and you probably have multiple needs or solution or problems you're trying to solve, opportunities. Then you move on to the timing about when you're going to need what. And you can actually do this on a simple kind of spreadsheet where you have, say, years in columns and some of these uses in rows, and think about when you might be using this stuff. So the annual payout, it's kind of constant. You hope your endowment's growing, but it's sort of, you want that every year, and it's pretty steady, as opposed to, as I say, the roof or that kind of thing. So you start thinking about when you might need these, and that leads to the next one, which is not only when are you going to need it, but what kind of lead time do you need? So suppose you've got investments or CDs or cash, whatever mix you've got, and you're pretty sure you're going to do the, I'll come back to the roof, you're going to do the roof in year 5, and let's hope it lasts till year 5. Let's suppose it does, and it's in your plan for that year, and maybe a year or 2 or 6 months or plenty of time in advance, you've said, I know I'm going to need that money for the roof. So you can look to how you've got liquidity, how you've got your cash invested in a way that when you need it, you're not going to be breaking up some other plan that you had or costing you money by breaking a CD or having to sell stocks when the market's down or that sort of thing. So it's a little bit different question than when might the money be needed. It's how much lead time you might need. And then talking about risk. So the basic issue with risk is the more money you want this endowment or these funds to churn out for you, the more risk you're going to have to take. And that means 2 things. You need to be clear about what appetite you have for problematic times, like the time that we're in right now. And you need to go back to that last question about the lead time, because over the long run, we hope that you've invested your endowment or your funds in a way that over the long run, they're going to keep growing. But the markets could dip or crash at any time. And if you don't have much lead time, you could find yourself at the wrong moment in the markets. So risk is very important. And we'll come back to talking about risk in a minute. But let me just say for now, risk is an important and really difficult conversation in an organization for 2 reasons. It's a somewhat technical conversation, and it's an emotional conversation at the same time. So there's a certain amount of education and study that's needed to understand what risk means in the market as you invest. And when any of us talk about money, it's loaded with all kinds of things from our own personal histories and our organizational histories and our feelings about money. So it all comes out in a risk conversation, and it's usually led by someone who is used to leading these conversations, who can be a little bit outside the organization. So we talk about risk, and it's different for each of these kinds of uses we talked about. And then based on these questions above, you talk about how you might invest these funds. And we'll talk about investing a little bit later, but really it's mostly about what's called the asset allocation. What kinds of investments rather than what specific investments. So I'll come back to this, as I say, but it's really in its broadest sense. You might say, well, how much do I want in the stock market versus bonds versus cash or something? I mean, there's many others. Versus, oh, I wish I'd bought Tesla. I think we should buy Tesla. That's so far down the list of what you should be thinking about. But it's really about what big buckets of types of assets that come out of these first 4 questions. And then for each of these, you would talk about managing them, and they have different answers to them. So for example, maybe you want your executive director or CEO to be able to use that cash buffer for certainly for the cash cycle, anytime they feel like it, right? You got government contracts and it's the end of the state's fiscal year, and it's going to be 3 months instead of 1 month for closing out the contracts. Why would you go to the board every year or every month to say, can I use some of our rainy day fund for the thing we knew was going to happen and it happens every year or every month? Versus saying, I know we had set this money aside for buying a building someday, but our people are in crisis. And you know what? Maybe we're never going to have that building, or we'll figure out another way to do it. That's a really different management and decision-making conversation. And so for each of these, it's not that you have a single decision-making or responsibility structure for all of your money. Different uses require different processes for managing and decision-making. And let's go back a slide just to remind ourselves about these different uses we were talking about, right? So they would have very different answers to each of these questions. So let's go forward again and just scan those questions 1 through 6. So now we get to segmentation, and you can see that some of these funds you might keep in the same kind of account the same kind of investment structure, as it were. So you could manage your long-term funds and medium-term funds and short-term funds under a big kind of strategy that met some of these goals. Other times you might just think, well, but for the cash flow part of it, the contract cycle and that sort of thing, no, we need a different account. We need literally a different bank account for it, or investment account, and different signatories and different rules and all those things. It doesn't make sense to mix them at all. But there's really nothing wrong with putting them together as long as you're thinking about it. And again, in that kind of grid where you've talked about those different uses. Also, when we talk about segmentation and we go back to that, you don't go back to the slide, but the prior slide with all those uses, I don't believe that you add all that up and you keep adding it and come up with a big whopper of a number. That some of these things about risks and cash cycles and those kinds of things, some of your funds are playing multiple roles and they have multiple uses. And you don't need to add and add and add every potential use of funds, because it's not going to be a realistic number in the end. So in that sense, you've not just commingled the funds in the same account, but you've thought of them as sort of flexible, multi-use potential funds. And of course, the danger is you need every kind of potential use all at the same time, but that's pretty rare, I think. And because, for example, you just, when the stuff hits the fan in a certain way, then other things are put on hold. So you're not going to need some of those longer term things at that time. And you have a chance to rebuild or raise more money. So
Well,
it's probably...
Yeah, and we've got some people mentioning that right now. And I know we're going to kind of pepper that throughout this, but we are in a crisis. And is there anything about this that you would recommend in terms, and you've been saying it, but obviously boards need to come together right now and reevaluate those uses and look at existing reserves, right? And potentially make some different decisions, whether it's maintaining payroll, floating funding losses, et cetera. Is there anything else you would say about how these questions shift or need to be revisited in this particular moment?
Well, you need to look at this question of long versus short term and what people call intergenerational equity. And there's no right answer to it, but I think people are looking at two crises. They're looking at how to save their organizations, and they're looking at how to help the world to fulfill their mission. They're related, but they're not the same thing. And because of the existential crisis about some organizations, people aren't even looking at, say, could we put more money out in the community? What are you talking about? I'm trying to save our organization or keep jobs in the organization, but you have a mission too. And you just might change that calculus in your mind about what your vision is about the long term. I would say this crisis, more than even 2008, possibly 2009, is raising some of that question for people because it's so visceral as a health issue.
Mm-hmm.
It's so right in front of us. It's not just an economic cycle.
Yeah, I know Robert Reich just did a talk where he said, please, this is a health crisis, not an economic crisis. And he wasn't downplaying the economic impact, but it's this frame issue, this mental model issue. So as we're having this conversation about the economics, I appreciate you reposition or, reminding us that these are all in service of the mission. And we might have to really change our calculus in this moment, as you said.
Yeah, and I've had conversations with people who are just saying, we'll raise that money for the future some other time. The world will bounce back. Let's not be afraid to use those resources that we had sort of tucked away for some other purpose. And others are feeling very differently about it. I'm going to run a little faster through some of the later slides because our last slide is about what to do in this crisis about cash.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions about the next slide though, so let's the next two. So let's make sure we get to those. So go ahead.
Okay, so let's keep going then. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what is and what isn't an endowment? And I said in the beginning, there are legal and common sense understandings about that. So if I guess you could say a capital E endowment has a different meaning than a small e endowment, and the small e being our common sense understandings. We're going to talk about the capital E in a second because that's about donor restrictions, really. But I don't want to go right there. I don't want people to think endowments really are about donor permanently restricted gifts, because endowment thinking should be broader than that. So here are what I think are the characteristics of the sort of small e endowment, thinking about the long term, is one, there's a long-term investment horizon to at least some of the funds. And that's about this sort of payout that you might expect. It's about growing it over time, the long-term sustainability. There are short-term responses, but it's really about that long-term investment horizon. And it's really about, to some extent, using the earnings and preserving the principal or the corpus of the funds, with exceptions, and whether or not the donor said, you can never touch my gift, you can only touch the earnings. It's sort of a mindset about setting aside something and not touching the corpus of it, but touching the earnings of it, whether the donor said it or not. And so, as I say, it's not necessarily about permanently restricted gifts. And I think our next slide is about we're coming up on something on the types of restrictions. And then this is very important. It's sort of invested and used in a very intentional and somewhat formal process, which is different than just a cash flow buffer fund for cash flow cycles and that sort of thing. That there are big conversations in the organization, with the board, with committees, with staff, with advisors, and you don't use it lightly either. And so that's part of the small e part of the endowment too. And that's about decision making too, that when you decide to change plan with an endowment or dip into it or use it, even the annual payout, it's a more formal process in my mind. So these are kind of the soft definitions of what do we mean by an endowment. I think the next slide, can we go to the, yeah. So let's talk about what an endowment isn't, or myths about endowments. It's most endowments, it's not true that none of the principal can ever be touched, because most endowments I've seen have all kinds of gifts in them, and even money put aside by boards and other things. So we're going to talk about that, but saying we have an endowment isn't the same thing as saying we can never touch any of the principle of it. There's a myth out there that you have a minimum distribution requirement. People hear about foundations and they say, don't foundations have to pay out 5%? Well, they don't actually, because they can spend a whole bunch of money on themselves too. But yes, they have to spend, say, roughly 5%. It's not true of endowments. It's not true of endowments that are set up with wholly restricted gifts from donors. There isn't any minimum payout requirement by law or regulation. There might be questions asked if you never use it. But there's no minimum payout requirement. It used to be people said, well, because they had this idea that foundations spend 5%, I guess. They say, well, for a long-term horizon, let's count on 5% of our endowment being thrown off every year for our operating funding. I don't think anyone short of very large institutions that have higher returns on their endowments should be thinking about 5%. And I'm not just talking about what's happened in the market recently. The market, we had a record length bull market, and to some people, they've never even worked in an organization or been an adult other than in a bull market. They just think that's sort of how the world's going to be. But long term, I think 5% is probably, even before this downturn, just not a smart thing to be thinking about. And partly because you want the corpus of the endowment to keep up with inflation and keep its value for the future. So you're not talking about averaging earning 5%. You're talking about that 5% plus a certain amount to keep the value of what's left there. There's an idea and a fear that raising money for an endowment will cannibalize your annual fundraising. And that can be true, but I think a lot of groups have found a way to grow both, actually, and deepen relationships with donors. And I've seen situations where people come, I think the idea is that you work with your major donors and they become your endowment donors. I've seen people who enter the organization as a donor, as an endowment or a campaign funder, because they hear about it during the public phase or the word of mouth of a campaign, and they become annual donors. And I think people are very capable of understanding the difference between an endowment gift or a campaign gift and annual giving. It's about communication and planning and being good about how you implement it. I don't think it's should be viewed as a big fear that way. And this last one, I can't use it in an emergency. We'll talk about that. So let's leave that for now, but that's not necessarily true either. So let's go to the next slide. So types of endowment funds. Now we're getting into, is it a capital E endowment or a small e endowment? Is it somehow legally or under regulation restricted? You can have unrestricted funds in your endowment that the donor said nothing about the use, and they wind up in a long-term investment horizon used for the same purposes that your long-term gifts are used for. And you can spend any of it. You can have a term endowment. This is unusual, but it's certainly out there, where the donor has said, well, for the first 20 years, I want this in an endowment type fund, for whatever reason that might be. Sometimes it's to help you get your endowment started or something. Or it might be after a defined event where you've reached a benchmark, or the world has, something's happened in the world and it's defined in the gift, and the thing happens and it's released from its restriction. A quasi-endowment, I've actually seen this used in different ways. I don't think you'd find quasi-endowment in the dictionary, maybe Urban Dictionary. It's most commonly used as the board has designated funds to the endowment in a formal kind of way. But the board can undesignate it the next day. And that's why you see in audits you see designated endowments or board designated funds as a type of unrestricted assets, because the day after the audit's published, the board could easily unrestrict it, undesignate it. It's just a temporary thing. It doesn't have at all the meaning of a donor restricted gift. So it's called a quasi-endowment. And it's very common for boards to designate parts of funds into an endowment. And finally, we have the restricted endowment where the donor says, in perpetuity, I never want you touching this principal. This is for an endowment. You can use the earnings. Sometimes they even say, I only want you to use the earnings for, say, your food pantry, or commonly in educational institutions for your scholarship program. I only want it for that. And the last point being that that specific use could be what I call fungible or not, meaning mixed with other funds. So it's common with educational institutions. You have a budget for scholarships and you raise a bigger endowment. You're not required to raise the amount of total scholarships. You're just using endowment funds for something you were going to do anyway. So even a restricted use endowment gift doesn't mean you're adding your spending in that area. It could just be fungible in the sense that you're just using that instead of your own resources. So those are the types of restrictions. So let's go to the next slide. We'll talk about how you might go about building an endowment. And again, half of you already have endowments, so presumably you've done some of these things. Let's go to the next slide. So first you might ask yourself, should you really build one? And the first question is, do you have the capacity? And most people think capacity means, do you have donors out there? But it really also means, do you have capacity in your organization? And the question is often answered through what's called a feasibility study, which is you hire from someone outside the organization to give you an opinion, and they look at your donor base and they look at how you run your organization, your systems. And they don't typically say no or yes endowment or no endowment. They say, well, if you were to go ahead with your endowment campaign, I don't think it would be successful beyond this amount. And here's the changes that you need to make in your organization to be successful at that amount. Do you still want to go ahead? And everybody can benefit from some changes in their organization, certainly. But not everybody really has the capacity to do that. And there's just as you can find donors who came to your organization through a campaign and had never heard of you, it's really dangerous to say, we'll build a campaign based on people who aren't yet donors to our organization. So a conversation about an endowment might lead to a major donor program. Forget the endowment. It might really benefit the organization because you said, well, here's the way to get to a major donor base that will allow us to build an endowment. So the answer was no, but of great benefit to the organization anyway. On the opportunity cost, I wouldn't underestimate what it takes to raise and manage an endowment, especially the raising part, that you're going to be using a lot of time and resources and your executive's time. There's no way around that. So you want to think carefully about what else is going on in your organization while you're trying to do that. And are your executives up to it? So there's a question about your current mission versus money locked up in the endowment. You may be successfully or unsuccessfully raising a whole lot of money for your current mission and need a lot more money for that. So if you're providing basic services or that sort of thing, it may or may not make sense to take money and lock it up in the endowment, in a long-term endowment. You need to look at that slide back there about the different uses. And it'd be nice to have an endowment, but when you really take a close look at this question of your mission, maybe it just doesn't make sense. The intergenerational equity question I talked about before. It's a really kind of awkward phrase out there in the world, but it's really about the future versus the present. And I think people are always saying to foundations, you should be spending more than that 5%, especially since we've had this good run in the market for so many years? And the answer is often about intergenerational equity. And it's a hard conversation to follow sometimes because it can sound like you're hiding behind that. Conversely, in this moment, you could say, what's happening right now, we don't know what's going to be, where this is all heading, but you could say, I'm less concerned about our mission in the future than I am right now about our people, and for this reason. And you come up with a different answer. And sometimes that answer isn't, let's build an endowment or keep an endowment. The point about the time value of money, the second to the bottom one, is that you've got to think about keeping that value of the endowment in real dollars. As inflation happens and the world changes, if you're committed to an endowment, you don't want to see it shrinking. You don't want to be spending down the endowment and it doesn't keep up with the purpose it was intended for, which is being strong in the future and having your organization strong in the future. And finally, we talked about the synergy or cannibalization with annual fundraising. Different organizations might have a different answer to that about whether they should go ahead and build an endowment. So these are some questions. It's not right for everybody. So let's go to the next slide. People go right to the bottom here usually. Oh, we raise an endowment through a capital campaign. I mentioned some of these others about the levels of restriction. Actually, a lot of endowments are built through different ways. You can transfer some of your retained surplus over time or in a particular year. You can build an endowment by setting aside in your budget a gain that's intended for an endowment, not for a reserves or rainy day fund. And you can transfer windfall surpluses, which not everybody has the good fortune to have happen to them, but a one-time bequest. The board could say, even though the donor said this isn't for an endowment, we've been talking about this and we're going to designate this to look like an endowment. Or people have one-off transactions. They sell a building, something comes to an end, a bunch of money comes to the organization. It's not really a bequest, but you should ask yourself, gee, is it right for an endowment? So let's go to the next slide. And we'll talk a little bit about managing an endowment. I'm not going to get into much detail here because I want to leave time for the current crisis, and I'm not giving investment advice here. So let's keep going. Next slide. We'll talk very briefly about regulatory and compliance concerns. This is not advice. This is the advice I'm giving you is make sure you know what you're getting into on each of these and who to give you advice. You've got to have a good system for recording, tracking, and complying with the restrictions of your donors. You've got GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, audit disclosure requirements once you start getting those restricted gifts for an endowment, but also once your board starts calling something an endowment, even if it wasn't funded from restricted gifts. And you've got cost and disclosure requirements from having an endowment. You've got conflict of interest concerns anytime you're moving towards investing in something beyond CDs and cash. And the very strength you want in your organization, which is having investment people on the board, you've got to be super careful about conflicts of interest also. You could choose to set up a separate holding corporation for your endowment. You see this all the time. You write a check to the fund for something or the friends of something, right? They're separate corporations just to hold the endowment. It's actually very simple and cheap to get a 501c3 tax exemption for what's called a support corporation, whose only tax exempt purpose is to support an existing 501c3. It's not hard to do that, but there are compliance requirements that come with that. And the reason a lot of people do it is to separate the endowment from liability or from sort of bleeding into other uses. So if you get sued, you could have an endowment that's safe from that, but the trade-off is you can't fully control the endowment corporation. or it's not really separate from you. So there's a lot to think about with separate corporations. And finally, fiduciary requirements. That's a 5-syllable word and an unpronounceable acronym, both of which make it super important and scary. So let's go on to the next slide about that. There is a series of, I think they're really state laws that are built on a standard template called UPMIFA. And I said to Jean that I'd reveal how it's pronounced, but we don't have time for that. So there are two big things about this. It's the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act. And one is you need to understand what a fiduciary is, because this is really different in a tax-exempt organization than, say, your family or a private foundation or yourself. You're taking care of someone else's money, and there are regulatory and legal requirements if you're going to be doing that. And they all circle around this idea of a prudent person, which Jean said, I'm glad they're not calling it prudent man anymore. But it's because that for centuries was a doctrine, the prudent man. It's a prudent person, and basically, you see here, it's someone who acts in good faith and care of an ordinary prudent person in a like position. Well, that's sort of a circular definition, right? So they give you lots of checklists about what does it mean to be prudent. And you follow these things and you get some advice. It's super important to understand, and I'm not going to give any more detail on it today other than to say make sure you understand it. So now.
Okay, let's do a time check here. We have about 11 minutes, and I know you want to review the elements of an investment policy and the hierarchy of decisions. Can we try to maybe do that in 3 or 4 minutes and leave time for questions? Okay, next slide.
Yeah. So there's a document called the Investment Policy Statement, IPS, that most organizations would have for an endowment or a long-term investment plan. And I'm just going to list the elements that would go into this. The real point is not to produce a book, but to have had the conversation and understanding about each of these things. That's really the purpose of it. I would not take a template from my investment advisor or a bank or a trust who says, here's the one we use, because it will work for them and it won't work necessarily for you. So there's lots of templates out there. You can search the web and get good ones. They're all out there. So we're going to run through what's in each of these. So there are the overall objectives, and we're coming back to that very first slide of why are you having an endowment? What do you want it to do for you? To find a way to state that. We talked about cash flow expectations and payouts. I think it's very common these days to say long term, we'd like to have as a baseline X% coming out, but every year in our budget, we'll set a target for that. So you wouldn't necessarily lock yourselves in an investment plan and say, we're going to take out 4% a year, because then you have to change your investment policy statement if you only want to take out 3% or 5%. So you put in a long-term expectation and leave it for your annual budget cycle to decide about it. You usually set that based on the averaging of multiple quarters of the value of the endowment. So if the endowment's way up on the eve of your budgeting, you don't want to take 4% of a little spike in the market. And conversely, if the market's way down, maybe you want to take more than 4% of what's in there right now, because on average, over the last 3 years, here's the number, and that's kind of how most people do it. The next part we talked about in those questions you want to ask yourself, so I'm not going to go into much detail, but what's the time horizon of what you're doing here? How do you think about diversification and risk? That risk conversation being really critical. Are you going to call out anything that's prohibited as an investment? And here's where you might say something like, we're too small and we're never going to fully understand alternative investments, crazy things, weird kinds of hedge funds. So let's just say up front, we're not going to do those. Or you might say, we're not going to ever invest below this grade in bonds, and those grades are about risk, right? So you'd look for those things that you're going to prohibit. And then you talk about socially responsible investment guidelines. There's a lot of guidance out there on how to do that. I encourage everybody to do that. But let me say the big question for you is, do you want to screen away things, or do you want to actually have direct impact in your investing? I come out of the community development financial institution world, CDFIs, loan funds. So I feel strongly that if you can take the risk and return, you might consider putting your money into a fund or into an investment that has direct impact. Because aside from there being campaigns out there to divest, which might really affect investor corporate behavior, a lot of social screening makes you feel good and not feel guilty about having your money and making your money somewhere, but it may not be having a whole lot of impact out there. You can look at yourself in the mirror and say, I don't own any money in a gun manufacturer, but to have real impact with your investing, you might want to go further than that. And then you look at cost, and cost is not just what an investment advisor is charging you, but what each product is charging, and it's not always very transparent. And my experience is that many managers don't necessarily show you the full cost unless you ask very specifically. And that's not because they're paying themselves and not telling you about it, but they're not considering every single cost that may be embedded in something. So you need to think about that. And then asset allocation, I referred to before, being this question of the broadest level. What percent do we want in stocks? What percent in bonds? What percent in cash? Or within stocks, how much international do we want? How much this? Forget about which stock. Forget about even which mutual fund. This determines 80 to 90% of your returns over time, the broadest categories, not being a stock picker. And when I go to that, back to that fiduciary slide and prudence slide, you shouldn't be looking for stock pickers. That's my strong opinion as a nonprofit tax-exempt group. You should be investing wisely about broader categories and finding ways to capture the performance of those broader categories, not listening to someone's advice about a hot stock they heard about. We don't have time to talk much more about that. Let's go to the next slide. You need to have some way of how you're going to evaluate the performance of your portfolio, and it's usually about benchmarking. It's saying, compared to what? Compared to not having taken a very advanced view of managing, or a very active view of managing, if you just sat on very broad indices of return. Again, we don't have time for this today, but you'll look into this as you develop your policies. You want to write down something about how you'll select and replace an advisor or manager. You want to be super clear about decision-making authority for that manager, what they can do without consulting you. And you want to be clear within your own organization about roles and responsibilities. So that's what goes into the investment policy statement. So I think at the end here, did we have questions here? Because we had a slide about.
We do. Let's. I think we should just go forward 2 slides if we can. I think that, and we'll just leave it here while we take some of these questions. I think a lot of the questions are about, okay, in this moment in crisis, you've been talking about very helpfully that there's an overgeneralization that endowments of various types mean permanently restricted. Can you talk a little bit more about payout, touching the principal? Are those things that can be revived in this moment, whether it was by policy or by donor restriction? How should we be thinking about tapping our endowments differently in crisis than maybe we had originally conceived, whether those were myths or policies or both?
Yeah. So let's look down at the 4th bullet here for one thing. Let's start with the 3rd bullet. You may have some accumulated funds that you haven't distributed that have been earned on the restricted part of your endowment. So if you've been following this idea that you shouldn't be distributing every penny you're earning, because you want to keep the value in the long term of the endowment, you could basically claw back to funds you didn't take in prior years. Suppose you've been taking 3 or 4% a year and you've been earning a lot more than that over this long bull market. So your endowment still has, the restricted portion doesn't grow with inflation. The restricted portion stays with what was the amount of the original gift. And on top of that, you have or haven't been growing what's in the endowment in excess of what you've been distributing out to your organization. So that layer on top of the restricted gifts, you could say that's all it's available for spending. It's this intergenerational question of, given the crisis right now, do you want to peel off all that stuff you've been putting away in addition to the original restricted gift or not, or how much of it? So that's one way of asking it. There isn't a right answer to it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fourth point, you can go to your donors if you have good relationships with them and they're still alive. Say, I know you gave this for the endowment. Let me, you looked at the news today. Let's have a conversation about unrestricting some of the corpus of your gift, or changing that restriction so it could be used in a different way. And people do that. A lot of people did that in 2008, 2009.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like naming opportunities on buildings and going back to the donor and saying, either you put it, I won't name any cultural institutions, either you put in another 200 million, or we got to rebuild this thing after 50 years and we need to take your family's name off of it.
Mm-hmm.
So it does happen. So yes, there are ways to do that.
And maybe we should close on that last point, though, because a lot of us in this sort of crisis moment are also talking about organizational continuity, business continuity. So maybe just speak to that last point, and we'll wrap for now, though there'll be a lot of COVID coverage and webinars coming from NPQ in the days and weeks ahead. But let me give you that final bullet to close with, Paul.
Yeah, it's related to the very first bullet about continuously reprojecting your cash flow, which needs to make some assumptions about how the world is deteriorating or going to recover, right? It's not so easy to do that, but you've got to find a way to do that sort of objectively, cold-heartedly in a way. Don't kid yourself about what it might look like. And then you come to a point where you're saying we're going to run out of money here, and it could be April 1st, it could be September 30th. But the goal isn't to run out of money. Mm-hmm. Because then one more shock to the system, and what is happening? You're going to miss payroll, you're going to miss a loan payment, something disaster, right? So you need to have a goal in mind about what your bottom line is for retaining some kind of funds to survive as an organization, and when are you going to hit that point, not when are you going to hit zero. And that's a difficult conversation to have. So that's what the last bullet's about.
Yeah, I can imagine a lot of emergency finance committee meetings and senior management team meetings right now, and looking back at those opportunities and problems and realizing, as you mentioned, that we may be having multiple right now. We have a health crisis with we want to keep our employees employed, but we also want to respond to our community, and that's going to raise a lot of questions about the use of reserves or undistributed earnings on endowments at this time, both for nonprofits and we hope for foundations. So
I would just like to say that when we say rainy day fund, rainy days come, and you should really be open to the idea that maybe it is and maybe it isn't an actual rainy day, and things that you've been very conservative about. This is it. It's happening. Mm-hmm. This is it. This is why you saved that money. And I'm not telling you to go ahead and spend that money, but it's raining out there.
It's raining. Paul, thank you so much. We're going to leave it there. And as I said a moment ago, NPQ's coverage of HR and finance and philanthropy during COVID is going to continue and pick up at a pace. We've got 3 webinars in development for the next 6 or 8 weeks or so. So this is the beginning of a conversation about how we manage ourselves financially and otherwise in these unprecedented times. And I appreciate, Paul, your preparation for this and adapting with us to this moment in time. Thank you.
thank you all for taking time today. I know you're awfully busy and the world's going a little crazy.
Yeah, thank you all, and we'll see you at the next session.